In today's video, we're going to talk about some common myths about women's health. If you're new here, hi, my name is Denise. I'm a psycho health coach and clinical herbalist. So let's talk about myth number one, which I would say is probably our most common and detrimental myth, and that is that you can get pregnant at any time in your cycle. Now, I don't know about you, but my sex ed was lacking, to say the least. We were essentially taught that you can get pregnant at a drop of a hat, and if you do have sex, you'll become pregnant, and or you will horribly die of an STD. That was basically all we were taught. And it wasn't until I was in my mid 20s that I decided to further my education on cycle health as I was dealing with a hormonal imbalance that I come to realize that that's not the case. What I would now consider as what should be common anatomy and physiology that is taught to everyone isn't the case because it is biological. You can't become pregnant outside of when you're ovulating. So basically, when you ovulate, the egg is viable for 24 to 48 hours. Now, each egg is viable for only 24 up to 24 hours, but in the cases when you ovulate with two eggs, for instance, in the case of twins, then each egg is viable for 24 hours. So that's where that 24 to 48-hour window comes from. Now, the key to this, though, is that sperm can live up to 5 days in cervical fluid, which, if you don't know what cervical fluid is, don't worry about it. We'll cover it in a little bit later. So that pushes it up to maybe 7 days that you can become pregnant. Outside of that window, it is impossible to become pregnant because there is nothing to then fertilize. Hence why this is a big myth, and I really don't know why it is not taught in even at least basic anatomy physiology, at least at like the high school level. Now, something I do want to note here though is that individuals that do have longer cycles or cycles where you're not ovulating or you didn't ovulate the cycle before, that could be a little bit different, in which case it'd be a little bit trickier to know exactly when you're ovulating. That's why having predictor apps, which I'm going to do a whole separate video on predicting period apps, but that's not really, it doesn't really work that way. So a better understanding of how you can track when you are ovulating or not would be something to go through the fertility awareness method, which I will also do a whole separate video on it, which basically is a in-depth form of cycle tracking where you're tracking every single day to see if you're fertile or not. So hold on, I will eventually do a video on that too. So myth number two is something that I'm 100% passionate about and just will fight to the death for. And that is the myth that you don't need to ovulate if you don't want to have kids. Now, I have heard that plenty on the internet. I've also heard it at gynecologist's office, doctor's office when I mention I probably don't want to have kids. I'm like 99.9% certain I don't want to have kids. And the general push on birth control is if you don't want to have kids, then you don't need to ovulate. It's not necessary. But that is not the case. Now, the reality of it is that we need to ovulate because ovulation is important for our overall health, not just for making babies. Now, ovulation is the process of obviously ovulating, but once you ovulate, it then turns into a gland called the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum then produces progesterone. Now, if you're new to understanding hormone health, then basically what you need to know is that we have two main hormones that deal with our cycle. We have estrogen and we have progesterone. And basically, they are an interplay between two forces. Now, these two hormones govern things like our breast health, cardiovascular health, bone health. They're pretty important to our overall health and body. So we do need to have both to be able to really say that we're like a healthy being because they do impact our overall health. So to say that we don't need to ovulate unless we want to have kids is a really big injustice to our overall health because that also pushes the narrative of that we are here just to reproduce, which we obviously know that's not the case because in cases of big stress, even like minor everyday stress, the first thing our body takes offline is reproduction. Because I mean, if we're stressed, not feeling well, in danger, sick, what have you, then our body will be like, okay, we don't want to reproduce, so let's not ovulate or we'll push it off. That is your body's first response to anything going awry, which is why cycle problems, hormonal problems are so common because that is your default, making sure that you don't have anything that can possibly make it worse if you're currently struggling with something. So having that mentality, of course, your body isn't just made for reproduction. It is for our overall health. So if anyone tells you that you don't need to ovulate to be healthy, they are completely wrong. Number three. Now, myth number three in itself isn't a myth, but it's more of a myth because we aren't taught about it, no one talks about it, and it's just kind of this silent thing that everyone experiences but doesn't talk about, and that is cervical fluid. So if you don't know what cervical fluid is, it is essentially that point in your cycle where you feel almost like a wetness or lubrication, and it's usually roughly around your mid-cycle, around ovulation. So let's talk about what's going on. What is that? So essentially, cervical fluid is made by your cervix, and it is a fluid. Now, it is directly connected to the amount of estrogen in your body. So that is why around ovulation or around that mid-cycle point, you get your peak cervical fluid because you're right about to ovulate. Now, cervical fluid is kind of this medium in which sperm can be kept alive because otherwise the vagina is pretty inhospitable to sperm as is. The pH is too low, it's very dry, like they just kind of die off within a couple hours. But whenever there is cervical fluid, it helps them stay alive for those 5 days that sperm can live up to. It's only within that cervical fluid that they can live up to those 5 days. Otherwise, they kind of just die off within a couple hours. Now, I find it wild that this isn't really taught to us, even though it is something that we all experience as people with uteruses. We all experience this because we all have cervixes and we all have estrogen that impacts cervical fluid production. And it's wild that no one talks about this. And it's even crazier because a lot of the times people don't know if it's something like a bacterial infection or yeast infection, and they go in like, hey, I have this weird fluid coming out of me, and it's just ovulation. And a lot of the times, doctors sometimes even say like, okay, here, just have some antibiotics or what have you for a yeast infection, bacterial infection, but it's just a normal part of our cycle. Now, there is this narrative that I always like to push back against when it comes to our anatomy or our bodies being annoying, a nuisance, gross, icky, whatever. So what I always try to say when I do talk about these certain things is the benefits of them. Now, when you think of cervical fluid, okay, you're like, okay, cool, there's this fluid that leaks out of me every so often. How is that going to be beneficial? It is beneficial if you're tracking your cycle using the fertility awareness method or other similar types of methods because you get to see when you're close to ovulating. If you're close to ovulating, if you have any type of cervical fluid, you can potentially get pregnant. It's good to know. It's important to know. So that is kind of like the plus side of having this part of our cycle and tracking this part of our cycle because we can see in real time whether we are fertile or not. All right, so thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Now, if you want any other type of videos, topics, conversations, or anything that is cycle health related, periods, menstrual products, what have you, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.